Before we begin, if you value serious, in-depth historical analysis focused on what actually kept people alive, not just what won battles, subscribe to the Survival Record and consider sharing this video with others who care about understanding history beyond the surface. When most people think about World War II, they picture tanks sweeping across Europe, carrier battles in the Pacific, and cities reduced to rubble from the air. The common assumption is that trench warfare belonged to the First World War, that by 1939, armies had evolved beyond muddy ditches carved into the earth. That assumption is only partially true. While the war was more mobile, trenches never disappeared. They re-emerged wherever movement stalled, in the frozen forests outside Moscow, along the Gustav Line in Italy, in the hedgerows of Normandy, on Pacific Islands, and across the Eastern Front. And in those trenches, soldiers relearned or reinvented survival methods that rarely make it into official histories. These weren't heroic charges or sweeping maneuvers. They were small, deliberate adaptations to mud, cold, artillery, disease, hunger, and psychological strain. Many of them shaped post-war doctrine and still influence modern fieldcraft. Let's examine 10 of the survival strategies hidden in those trenches, lessons carved into earth under fire. The first reality is that drainage, not firepower, determined who survived long-term trench deployments. In static sectors from the Italian campaign to the Eastern Front, trenches quickly became water traps. Rain, groundwater, and melting snow pooled at the bottom, creating conditions for trench foot, frostbite, and infection. Soldiers in formations like the German Wehrmacht and the Red Army learned that drainage was a life-preserving priority, not a comfort issue. Improvised sump pits were dug at low points, gravel, rubble from destroyed villages, and even wooden ammunition crates were broken down and laid beneath duckboards to elevate standing surfaces. Units rotated men specifically to maintain trench floors and drainage channels, even under shelling. Poor drainage meant immobility, soldiers too sick or frostbitten to fight. Post-war military engineering manuals institutionalized this lesson. Fighting positions must shed water as efficiently as they resist bullets. Insulation from the ground became, honestly, more important than insulation from the air. Cold air is survivable, but frozen ground, well, it steals heat directly from the body. On the Eastern Front, especially during those brutal winter battles around the Battle of Stalingrad, soldiers discovered that lying or sitting directly against earth walls really accelerated hypothermia. Improvised insulation became absolutely critical. Straw from nearby farms, doors ripped from hinges, even civilian furniture were used to line trench walls and floors. German and Soviet troops both learned to construct shallow dugouts with overhead cover and raised sleeping platforms, even when time was limited. Sometimes just a few inches of elevation from frozen soil could determine whether a soldier retained enough strength to stand guard. Modern survival doctrine emphasizes ground insulation in cold environments, and that principle was not theoretical. It was reinforced in trenches where men froze slowly from below. Overhead cover evolved into protection not just from shrapnel, but honestly, from psychological collapse. World War II artillery was more powerful and sustained than in 1914 to 1918. On fronts such as Monte Cassino in Italy, under constant bombardment, trenches without overhead cover became death traps. But even when shells did not land directly, the concussive force and debris absolutely shattered morale. Units in both Allied and Axis formations constructed reinforced dugouts with layered timber, sandbags, and earth overhead. The purpose was not only physical protection, but psychological stability. Soldiers who believed they had some barrier between themselves and constant shell fire maintained cohesion longer. Post-war studies into combat stress recognized the stabilizing effect of protective shelter. In trench environments, survival meant preserving mental resilience as much as bodily safety. Field sanitation systems were engineered with surprising rigor under, pretty primitive conditions. Disease historically kills more soldiers than bullets. In World War II, trench sectors, especially in humid climates like New Guinea, poor sanitation threatened entire units. Japanese defensive networks on Pacific Islands demonstrated highly organized latrine placement downhill and downwind from primary trench systems. American forces confronting entrenched defenders adapted quickly. Waste disposal trenches were separated from living areas, and lime, when available, was applied to reduce contamination. In Europe, units often designated specific trench branches for hygiene, with strict enforcement. These systems weren't glamorous, but they prevented dysentery outbreaks that could incapacitate companies. The lesson was institutionalized survival planning must integrate sanitation as a core defensive measure. Camouflage was treated as a living discipline, not just a one-time effort. In those static trench lines during campaigns like the Italian campaign, aerial reconnaissance and artillery spotting posed, constant threats. A trench visible from the air would soon be zeroed in. So soldiers learned to continuously adapt their camouflage as the seasons changed. Freshly turned soil was darkened with local vegetation, and snow was packed and shaped to eliminate any unnatural lines. Netting was reinforced with regional foliage, which had to be replaced daily as it wilted. This was not decorative. It actually disrupted enemy targeting cycles. Modern fieldcraft still emphasizes dynamic camouflage maintenance, a practice really refined in the trench systems of World War II. Listening posts extended survival beyond the trench itself. Instead of just passively waiting for an attack, units established forward listening posts at night, sometimes just yards from enemy lines. On the Western Front after D-Day, including sectors near the Battle of Normandy, these positions provided early warning of infiltration attempts. Small teams rotated quietly into shallow forward pits after dark. Their purpose wasn't engagement, but rather detection. Early warning allowed trench defenders to prepare flares, reposition machine guns, or even call mortar fire before being overrun. This method actually influenced later perimeter defense doctrine. Survival in a trench depended on extending awareness beyond its walls. Food storage and heat discipline were carefully balanced to avoid detection. Cooking in a trench created smoke and scent detectable by both ground patrols and aircraft. Soviet and German forces alike often relied on cold rations during daylight hours in exposed sectors. When heat was necessary, small smokeless stoves were constructed within dugouts, vented horizontally through extended flues designed to cool smoke before release. These improvised systems reduced visible signatures. Caloric intake remained vital, especially in winter, but survival required balancing nutrition against concealment. The tactical management of heat signatures would later become a key consideration in modern infantry survival planning. Rotational micro-rest systems, really preserved combat effectiveness under constant threat. In those prolonged trench stalemates, uninterrupted sleep was just impossible. Artillery harassment and patrol activity kept soldiers in a state of, near constant alert. So, units developed these micro-rotation systems, short scheduled rest intervals in reinforced dugouts while others maintained watch. The principle was simple but absolutely critical. Exhaustion leads to poor judgment. Poor judgment in a trench leads to fatal mistakes. Exposure during shelling, failure to detect infiltration, mishandling of weapons. Military psychology research after 1945 formalized rest cycles as a necessity in sustained operations. But in World War II trenches, it was learned the hard way, through attrition. Improvised structural reinforcement honestly saved lives during collapse events. Trenches in clay or sand-heavy soil frequently collapsed under rain or artillery shock. On the Eastern Front and in North Africa, Soldiers scavenged materials, rails, doors, beams, to shore up weak walls. These reinforcements were often crude, but they prevented burial during bombardment. Structural redundancy became standard practice: double-layered revetments, angled supports, and stepped trench profiles to prevent progressive collapse. Modern combat engineers would refine these practices, but the principle was field-tested in World War II trenches, where collapse was as lethal as enemy fire. The final and, honestly, most overlooked survival tool was disciplined routine. Trench survival depended less on heroics and more on disciplined repetition. Cleaning weapons daily despite mud, checking drainage after every rainfall, reinforcing camouflage each morning, rotating sentries on schedule. These routines, simple as they sound, countered chaos. In environments where soldiers had little control over bombardment or strategic direction, maintaining small, repeatable tasks preserved order and morale. Military historians often emphasize technological superiority or operational brilliance, but at the trench level, survival hinged on mundane discipline executed without fail. World War II did not abandon trenches, it transformed them. Wherever movement stalled, soldiers returned to earthworks and rediscovered the same elemental truths. Water kills, cold drains, strength, sanitation prevents collapse, concealment preserves life, and routine sustains the human mind under strain. These lessons influenced post-war fortification design, cold weather doctrine, perimeter defense systems, and even survival training for modern infantry. They remind us that beneath grand strategy lies the granular reality of staying alive one day at a time. Understanding these overlooked survival methods, honestly, deepens our perspective on the war itself. It shifts focus from sweeping offensives to the lived experience of endurance. How ordinary soldiers adapted, engineered, and disciplined themselves to survive in the harshest conditions imaginable. If you value this kind of careful, grounded historical analysis, subscribe to the Survival Record and share this video with others who want more than surface-level history. These stories matter, not because they are dramatic, but because they reveal what war truly demands of the human body and mind.